Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today I'm going to be going over another hand from that same €5,000 European Poker Tour event I played in the previous hand. Here we are against the exact same player as the previous hand, the guy who I folded a full house to in the previous video. If you've not watched all the past videos I've made for Poker News, check them out. You can just search for all of the videos I have made. You'll see that the Poker News one comes out once per week. Also, check out my weekly podcast, Weekly Poker Hand, which is relatively similar to this, where I go over an interesting poker hand each week. You can also download that on iTunes or the Stitcher app or wherever you get your podcast. So here, the same player raises. I like to just call with ace-king in the hijack seat. So this may look a little bit snug, but I'm okay with ace-king staying in your calling range, especially if you don't want to be doing a whole lot of 3-betting for various reasons. The main reason you don't want to be doing a lot of 3-betting in tournaments, the main time that comes up, is when the players yet to act are all very weak, and you want to do everything you can to keep them in the pot. I imagine that's probably what is happening in this scenario, because quite often in main events, there are a lot of satellite qualifiers who are playing well above their head, and I'm a big fan of keeping satellite qualifiers in with with as wide of a range as possible, because they are going to make errors, and if your opponent's going to be making errors, you want to keep them in the pot. Also, whenever you 3-bet hands like ace-king, your opponents are going to fold out stuff like ace-7, and you really want to keep ace-7 in when you have ace-king. So I'm okay with this call. I think in general I'm going to 3-bet this probably 85% of the time or so, but calling is certainly fine given the right table dynamics. 10-4-2, not a good flop. Our opponent bets 1,200. Our hand is certainly good enough to call. This is a scenario where I think a lot of amateur players mess up by just folding. They think, well, I missed with my ace-king, so I have to fold. But you always have to think about your opponent's range and how the board connects with that range. And this is a board that should not connect very well with many hands at all. So because of that, ace-king, if it was good pre-flop, is relatively likely to be good on the flop, especially when my opponent makes this somewhat small bet of 1,200 into 3,000. I have a very easy call. I'm not necessarily calling because I'm trying to play a huge pot with this hand, but this is a hand that I can call one bet with and then see what develops on the turn. So I do call. Turn is a jack, and my opponent checks. So if I bet, can I ever make my opponent fold a hand like pocket fives? Because that is primarily the hand I'm trying to get my opponent to fold if I do bet. Or a hand like 5-4 or ace-2. And I don't really know the answer to that. I think I would probably prefer just to check in this scenario. Notice if my opponent did have a hand like king-jack, queen-jack, jack-9, jack-8, etc. that he decided to bet on the flop, he is never folding the turn. He's also never going to fold a 10, at least on the turn. And I don't really think I'm trying to 3-barrel this. So there may be a little bit of merit in betting for protection with this hand to try to get a hand like 8-7 to fold. Notice if I bet 1,400 and 8-7 folds, that's a fine result. So we're running into this issue where if I bet small, we run the risk of a hand like pocket fives calling. And if I bet too big, I run a risk of only getting called when I'm in pretty bad shape. So I'm not really sure what the right bet size is in the spot if I am going to bet, but I think checking in this scenario is actually the right play the majority of the time. I don't know what I did in this spot, but if I was playing this hand today, I would probably just check behind and hope to win at showdown. I do like to bet 2,200. I don't like this bet size. I think this is probably an error because, again, when I bet this size, I have no clue what my opponent's going to do with many worse hands. Of course, we are semi-bluffing to some extent because we always have the outs, but it's not like we expect to hit the outs too often. Get a queen on the river. That's good. We have the nuts now. I'll certainly bet on the river. I prefer a somewhat big bet. And remember in the previous video, I actually bet a little bit more than the size of the pot with the full house. I got check raised and I had to fold. Here I like to bet big again, this time even bigger, because I think a lot of the times when you're playing against the same players, they often expect you to do the same thing with similar strength hands in similar spots. And I'm not necessarily saying that this hand is that similar to the previous hand, but we did just make a very big bet on the river in the previous hand, and our opponent check raised, and I folded. So if our opponent is not very sophisticated and not thinking that I'm just making this play with various parts of my range, the top and the bottom, he may think that I just bet big when I'm bluffing. And that is how some players think, and it's important to realize that is how some players think. So for that reason, I definitely like a big bet here. Notice if my opponent has any jack or 10, it very often has two pair now. He could easily have a hand like king, queen, or ace, queen that improves the top pair, and I don't really see those hands folding, although they actually should strongly consider folding. So anyway, I like this bet, especially given my opponent may even think I'm tilty from the previous hand. There are a lot of factors going on, and this is where in live poker, you really do have to be aware of the table dynamics. Online, this kind of thing doesn't come up so often, but in live poker, you can very often play off of the image that you have based on what's been happening in the recent past. Usually, though, the best players realize that the recent past doesn't even matter that much. So I bet 15K. And again, my opponent check raises me on the river. This is good. We're going to call. We have the nuts. And my opponent has ace-king. That's unfortunate. I was really hoping to see something like a set of 10s there that played it really slow or something like that. But he does have ace-king. I'm trying to think if it's an interesting thing because our opponent elected to bet the flop with the ace-king, then check call the turn, then check raise the river. I guess that's a fine strategy. I'm trying to think if he should have played this hand differently at any point, and maybe he could check the flop, but I think betting is fine because he can get called by ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-x, various hands like 6-5. He has plenty of equity versus everything. So actually, I think my opponent played his hand perfectly acceptable. I like his check on the river because this is a card that should connect very well with my range, kind of like it connected with his with queen jack, queen 10, stuff like that. I should also have a lot of those hands in my range. So he wants to check, allow me to bet, and then check raise, especially given he check raised on the previous hand. He has a really good reason to believe that I am at least capable of making those bets on the river. So that's going to be it for this hand. If you enjoyed this hand, like I mentioned previously, check out my podcast. It's called Weekly Poker Hand. Also, I just released a new poker application that teaches you to make profitable pushing or folding scenarios with a short stack. You can actually use it right at the poker table. You load up the scenario very quickly and easily with just the tap of one button at the table. And it's probably going to end up getting telephones banned at the table is what I think is probably going to end up happening because it is that easy to use. So if you never want to make a bad push again, check out the Float the Turn Push Fold app. You can find that in the Google or Android App Store and also at jonathanlittlepoker.com/app. So again, thank you very much for watching. I'll be back next week with another fun poker hand.